outside of Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center, where I used to work, was third. I think that they joined in the late 90s or early 2000s once they moved to their new facility there off La Crosse Boulevard. And then finally, BRIT, the Botanical Research Institute of Texas. They recently joined. Out of the three of these, or four of these currently, I would have to say that San Antonio is the most active. Part of that just due to the work that I've been doing throughout South Texas. And since I work in West Texas, a lot of the West Texas work we've been doing. And then, of course, as I travel back and forth, anything that I come across throughout Central Texas, and then, of course, any of the travels that I do in East. So we're kind of covering a huge area of Texas. Meanwhile, some of these other organizations are pretty much staying local. They don't tend to get out too much. So one thing about the Center for Plant Conservation, it is a national organization, and it's an association of botanic gardens throughout the United States. Recently, they've been bringing on individuals. So if anyone's interested, anyone that does nurseries or anyone that does any sort of work with rare plants, they can actually join without being associated with a botanic garden, which is a recent change that they've done. Oop, hold on. I always like to start off by showing this ecoregion map of Texas. Many people don't see this. This is the level 3 ecoregion map. This shows our ecoregions that we have throughout the state. A lot of people think that the Gould's ecoregion map, which is actually really a vegetation zone map for Texas, is sort of the go-to map to use. However, it's really basic. This one's a little bit more detailed. This is the one that we generally use when we're talking about the ecoregions throughout Texas. They do have a level 4, which is a little bit more detailed. It starts to split these ecoregions up into smaller segments. And then, of course, within those segments, you have various habitats and plant associations. And by plant associations, what I mean is like when we do survey work, we'll look at something, and let's say we're in the Davis Mountains, and we may be in a high elevation oak, juniper, pine woodland or forest. We might be in a north-facing slope, which would be predominantly, what would that be? Populus tremuloides, which is the aspen grove. We have a few aspen groves out here. So we can really become, or really be fine detailed whenever we start looking at these plant associations. And generally speaking, this is a rough number. It's probably anywhere between 5,800 to 6,000, depending on how many subspecies or varieties that there are. But we have about 6,000 taxa in Texas. And about 10% of those, 600 or so, are considered non-native plants. And some of those are, agricultural plants, but generally about 600 species are non-native. So out of those 6,000, roughly, we have 450, roughly, rare plants. And these are what Texas Parks and Wildlife and others call species of greatest conservation need. What does that mean? Well, out of those 450, only about 31 are listed by the state or the federal government. So they actually have some level of protection. I say some level because Texas is a predominantly private land or privately held state. So roughly 96, 97% of our land is owned or it is in private hands. So what you do with your private land is up to you. So sadly, plants don't have a whole lot of protection, but animals do. And so this has been going on for 20 years since I've been working with rare plants. They keep talking about trying to get more and more rigorous protection for these rare plants. It just has not happened yet. And one thing to note, in 2010, roughly, the last species list that TPWD put out for the rare plants or these species of greatest conservation need had about 200 species on it. We more than doubled that in basically a decade. And this is just going through research and looking at various collections, looking at historical data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see that 450, that plus minus, there's some plants on there that I don't necessarily agree with, but there's some plants on there I think, or there are some plants that need to be on the list that aren't on the list as of yet. So we have the ranking. I'm going to go back to that. If you look at the bottom of the where it says Pensman Cardinalis at the bottom, and there's a GS or G3S2, and what that means it's global 3, state 2, and these are the rankings that we apply to a lot of these plants. And that ranking is based on the number of known populations, the number of individuals in those populations, the location of populations, and any threats. And so obviously, knowing the number of populations we have is important. Knowing the number of individuals in each population is important. The locations of populations, that becomes important because it's some of the plants may be on in, let's say, Big Bend National Park or Black Gap or Big Bend Ranch State Park or Pedernales Falls State Park, any of the protected lands that we have. And so generally, the general thought is that these plants are already being somewhat protected just because they're on state property and there's monitoring that's involved, there's protection that's already involved. Some of the populations are on private land. Some of the populations are on state land, but that might be TxDOT right away. And so those generally don't have a whole lot of population. So then you are a lot of protection. So then we start looking at the various threats that are involved. So you can imagine something that's on a road cut along Highway 290, just outside of Fredericksburg, or between Fredericksburg and let's say Austin, might have a little threat involved, and that could be just simple highway expansion. It could be a wildfire. It could be any number of things that could happen. So that threat level is higher than something that like this Emeria, which is located in Black Gap Wildlife Management Area. That one is pretty well protected because it's an area that's rarely visited. Most people have no idea this plant exists. It's really hard to get to. No one's really going to make that effort to go down there and try to dig this up or remove it. So this one is actually pretty well protected where it is. And so when you start looking at all those different numbers and letters, so G is global, like I said, S is state, N is for national collections. So you can have plants that are just found in the United States, so they'll have an N in front of them. T or E, obviously threatened or endangered, and that's on the state level. H is historic, X is extinct, and then we have 1 through 5, which you can read those out. And what's highlighted in red is that's kind of where I am. That's most of the work that I do. Even prior to working for San Antonio, just sort of on my own, I was out tracking down these historic populations or historic plants, things that haven't been seen in 25 years. And if you're going back and you're not finding these plants and there's been a drastic change, let's say a shopping mall or who knows what might happen to the property, eventually these plants get placed on the extinction list or presumed extinct. And most recently, actually probably about 3 weeks ago, we came across where we found, I was working with a group of folks and we actually found a plant that was presumed extinct out here in West Texas. So that information will be coming out hopefully in the next week. So keep an eye out for that. I'm sure it'll be posted all over social media. So our threats, you know, I kind of alluded to some of those threats earlier. Habitat loss is one of the biggest, if not the biggest issue that we do have. Urbanization, anyone that lives in the big city can definitely see that. We don't really have that problem out here in West Texas. We're 12,000 people in the Tri-County area. So we don't really have a whole lot of growth here, but around urban centers, we definitely do. Range management. Again, if you're just managing for cattle, yes, you're going to be trying to make as much money as you can. So you might put out things like buffalo grass seed, which is a highly invasive species. This is a photo that was taken down in South Texas, which basically outcompetes all of our native plants, especially cactus. invasive species like the bufflegrass I just mentioned, but this was Arundo donax. This is growing along the banks of the Rio. I used to work with a bunch of folks out here that was doing that. We were doing sort of survey work, but they were doing invasive species removal specifically along the Rio, trying to get rid of the Arundo donax and the tamarisk. And on the upper slopes outside of the Arundo donax or riparian area, the bufflegrass is a huge, huge problem along the Rio. Agriculture, of course. This is a photo that was taken down in the deep South Texas, Cameron County. So you can see there's a sorghum field with wind farms, and pretty much the only thing growing there is sorghum. And of course, water management. This is the Rio. This is the Rio at El Paso. It is the only river in Texas that is continually sort of runs dry. I was just there about 2 days ago. It was flowing like it should flow. However, that was just a release that was coming from New Mexico from one of the dams upstream. And I have that little asterisk there. That means that's just basically currently. I'm sure that some of the other rivers, as we go forward, are going to start running dry as well, at least in segments. Here's a photo that was taken, I believe it was last year. And this is the Rio at Ruidoso, Texas, roughly between Ruidoso and Candelaria out here in West Texas. And that's about 6 feet wide. So that major river that kind of defines Texas is not really much of a river. I'm sure most people saw some photos of Santa Ana Canyon when was that? 2 months ago, roughly, and it ran dry there at the canyon, and it sort of made state and national news. And of course, we have loss of pollinators. These guys are associated with the agricultural fields down in South Texas or coastal prairies. But quite often they're just spraying relentlessly, and that spray is, killing any insects which are, feeding on those plants, which are then, we don't have those pollinators that might be in the area while there is adjacent to these ag fields. This photo was taken about, I would say, 100 meters from the southmost Nature Conservancy Preserve in Cameron County a few years ago. So I'm sure that there's some wind drift going on with that. And of course, poaching. Poaching is another issue that we have. A lot of people don't really think that that's such a big deal anymore, but I think that there's been some articles that have been coming out lately that have been showing how bad it truly is, especially out here in West Texas. These people are actually not poaching. This is a rescue that we did off of an aggregate mine out in El Paso County many years ago. But that one cactus that they're pulling out, Sphaerocactus wazazzenii, or the candy barrel cactus. One of those could, at that size, which is about 3 to 4 feet long or tall, easily fetch $750 to $1,000. And so you can imagine that if you can go and you can pull out a few of those, it'll make a little bit of money. But those are big, kind of hard to keep digging up. Some of the smaller ones are a lot more profitable because you can ship those out of the United States. Recently, and I say recently, this is about 2 years ago, but I can say recently because it seems like twice a year now, we're dealing with this out here in West Texas, where plants are getting confiscated at the border and they get turned over to Sol Ross, and then we have to find homes for these plants. Sadly, these plants cannot be sold. Sadly, we can't take them back to where they belong because they're basically not really going to make it. They're going to take extra care, for one. And two, quite often, we don't really know exactly where they came from. So we don't want to take something from, let's say, South Brewster County, or that was taken out of South Brewster County and put it back in the field, let's say in Valverde County. So we have to be really careful when we do those, when we repatriate these plants. We can't just like willy-nilly just go put them out wherever we think that they might be best. Most of these plants end up in the hands of botanic gardens or collectors that are not going to sell them. So this particular collection. It was estimated up to 15,000 plants were removed from the Big Bend region. When I say the Big Bend region, it's not clear if it was Big Bend National Park or the adjacent Black Gap. So that's a huge amount of plants that were taken out. These were being sold on eBay. They were being sent across international borders, state borders. They are CITES listed species. That means they're protected. You cannot ship them out over international or state borders without permits. And that's how these people got caught. It was estimated that they made over 300,000 in about 6 months. By the time we got to them, or the feds got to them, they had about 3,500 plants that we had to find homes for. Most of those were just held up at Sul Ross. Sadly, you have to wait until the trial's over before you can distribute them. And once we did, I think we ended up with around 2,000 that actually had survived. I was trying to find some old numbers on sort of the yucca trade and some of the other plants that were being sort of poached. Mexico is a huge problem. Most of these plants are ending up in botanic gardens, sadly, over in Europe, some private collections, but basically Europe, Eastern Europe, and Asia, especially Japan, Japan and China are huge markets for these plants. It's estimated somewhere around 23 billion, upwards to 23 billion, is the illegal wildlife trade, and that does include animals as well. So it's a huge, huge deal, and people can make a lot of money selling these guys. So I think it's coming back to the public's sort of and public knowledge that this is going on. And here's the photo that I'd like to share, or I'd like to show, because it shows sort of like our land management practices. This photo was taken down in southern Nueces County, outside of Refugio, and coastal prairie. But the odd thing, obviously, when you look at this, there's prickly pear in about 2.5, 3 feet deep water with water lilies. And so what this shows is this coastal prairie area, these areas that had these ephemeral wetlands when during summer rains would come through, that they're just not being managed well. This is actually rangeland. It's coastal prairie that's converted to rangeland. It's low. When it rains, it floods, and it's just a mismatch of what you might think of sort of South Texas thorn scrub species mixed with the wetlands, and it's pretty awful. But we were down there looking for some rare plants, and I happened to notice this. Sadly, our tax laws here in the state, they encourage this loss of diversity, and it's probably not something that a whole lot of people will say. But if you think about somebody that has, like, let's say 10, 15, 20 acres of land, it's very easy for them to throw some cattle on there and get the ag exempt, and they just sort of degrade the land over and over and over again. In turn, it would be best if they didn't have to do that, and they still had some sort of exemption. And people do say, well, what about the wildlife exemption? Doesn't that help? Well, it does, but typically what happens with wildlife exemptions, you're sort of managing for those game species, and you're not really going for the full biodiversity. So it'd be nice if the state of Texas could sort of maybe follow the lead of some other areas and go more towards this wildlife biodiversity, to where you're actually encouraging that biodiversity out there, as we all know that we're losing more and more of that every day. All right, so I can't see everything on here, but we do have some chat. So I'm gonna see if I can open this up.
Michael, I can tell you what the question is if that's what you're looking at.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, so there's a question about whether or not you utilize the Harry Cliff Bear Regional Herbarium collection to assist you with your local San Antonio historic plant research.
No,
Okay.
never used that one. Basically, I use SciNet, University of Texas, which is associated with SciNet, and some older publications is usually what I use whenever I'm researching plants. The online herbaria, the SciNet is sort of a consortium of herbaria across the Southwest and other areas, including like Harvard. But it has, I'm going to say, somewhere in the realm of 40 different herbaria that have all, well, not all, but have the vast majority of their specimens scanned. and you can research those and pull up really, really old records dating back to the mid 1800s. So of course they're not super helpful because, it might say, something that was collected in, let's say 1910, and it will say Pecos County. And if you look at a map of Texas in 1910, Pecos County is basically most of Western Texas. It was before Brewster County, Culberson, Hudspeth, all those other counties were added in later on. And so they're very vague, but sometimes you can sort of piece together historic journals and try to figure out where people were, and kind of, it's a little bit of a puzzle to put together at some point. So we're going to get into the plants at this point. And since we have chat, I'll have some people sort of chime in. So which plants of these 5 are rare? And I'll give you all a second or two to answer, and we'll see what happens. You can type that in your chat. Oh, I can see it. I have it open now.
And Michael, while people are thinking about this, if you are comfortable with it and you don't mind putting your camera on, there was a private message sent to me to ask if you could. We usually have our presenter have their camera on, if you're okay with that. Awesome.
There you
It
go.
sort of feels like we're with you in the room.
Well, no one's answering. Oh, wait.
There's
3.
a couple.
Well, I will tell you this, more than one of these are rare. So
I think one of them is a surprise. I think one of them is very available commercially, but naturally occurring is very rare. And I've recently learned this.
yeah, maybe. Well, no one else is answering, so we'll go to the next slide. Dang it. So yeah, actually all 5 are rare. So the Davis Mountain coral root, the Mexican mud plantain, and that was the plant we were looking for when we were down in South Texas and came across the prickly pear and the water lilies living together. The perennial caltrop, that's out here in West Texas. Red yucca, currently listed as rare. Oddly, you'll see people talk about this being a West Texas or a Chihuahuan desert species. It's not. It is not a Chihuahuan desert species. It is mainly, I would say, if anything, in Edwards Plateau. There are some populations in Valverde County, but on the eastern side of Valverde County. And there's some other populations sort of around San Saba and a bunch of other scattered populations kind of in between there. It is rare. And it is very common in the nursery trade, as is the orchid tree, which this is the pink flowered version. I'm sure y'all are used to the white flowered one that's in the nursery trade. It is also listed as rare. It's currently known from just 2 populations in Texas. One of those is on the Devils River, and the other one's in Surprise, the Anacacho Mountains, which is on private land. And it's my understanding that the white form was found on the Anacacho Mountains, and that became sort of the highly sought after plant that everyone had to have, back 20, 25, 30 years ago. And now it's so common in the nursery trade, the white flower version. Most people are really surprised to see that the true color of this is pink. So this is one I don't necessarily agree with, because one of the ranches I've worked on in Mexico, there are absolute like tens of thousands of these plants. So I think that that's just information that TPWD does not have, and they're not necessarily, they don't have access to everything. But yes, in Texas, you could say it's rare. Globally, probably not. So yeah, these 2 were just recently added, and if anyone shops at the Wildflower Center during their plant sales, Recently, they had published a list. They were saying that anything that was G3 or lower was not to be sold anymore. So things like the red yucca and the orchid tree were going to be not sold. I think they may have changed that since because there was a bit of backlash. But my argument is with these rare plants, and I tell people this all the time, quite often it is the smaller local nurseries, those regional nurseries that are people growing things out of their backyard or their back garden, or they've got a small plot of land and they're growing these plants. They're the ones that are going out and sourcing local genetics. They're the ones that are figuring out how to grow some of these plants. Whereas botanists, we're not really horticulturists. So when it comes time to like try to grow some of these, I'm like, oh, we don't know what to do. So quite often my go-to person was Dan Hosage of the Madrone Nursery, and he knew how to grow like so many of these plants. It's pretty amazing. And so without those folks, I think going out, collecting those local genetics, figuring out like germination protocols and what does that mean? Are there dormancy issues? Are there other issues with scarification? Do they need to be frozen for 3 months before you can germinate them? Blah, blah, blah. All these other things, like how much watering do they, when do you sow them? All of these things, people like Dan Hosage figured out. Sadly, he's retired now. I don't see anybody really picking up the stick behind him. But I'm all for growing rare plants, and I think we should grow more of them. And I think that the more people that have them in their gardens, the better it's going to be. So,
Michael?
Yep.
There's a question about the 5 rare plants that you showed. How many are naturally in San Antonio?
Which ones would you guess?
Ooh, me? Well, I didn't know about the orchid tree. I knew about the red yucca. So you surprised me with the orchid tree.
There's a record of the orchid tree outside of Brackenridge Park.
Interesting. I don't know the answer. I don't.
Potentially, the only one that I know that potentially would be in San Antonio proper, or historically was there before a giant building got plopped on top of it, would be the orchid tree. The red yucca, that's not within its range. The perennial caltrop is West Texas. The Mexican mud plantain or coastal or ephemeral playas, so coastal plain, and then up in the panhandle. The Davis Mountain coral root. There's some around Austin. There's like 1 or 2 populations around Austin, and the rest are out here in West Texas.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Sure. But this next one is close to San Antonio. This is the sycamore leaf snowbell. It is listed as endangered. It's one of, I believe, 4 subspecies. This is subspecies texana, so the Texas sycamore leaf snowbell. The map I'm showing actually shows the range of all subspecies, and I believe there's 4 in Texas. By far, habitat loss. Deer love to eat this plant, so high deer population. They tend to munch them down quite a bit. I don't think poaching was ever an issue with this. It was probably just habitat loss and increased number of deer and cattle in the area. This one is one that we have in the gardens, but over the past, we've been on seed collection from wild populations. We've tried to reintroduce it to areas, and we've shared the seed with other folks. I've got one of these in my garden. It does really quite well. Sadly, I planted it in the front garden where the deer tend to walk down the sidewalk and munch it every once in a while. So this year during the drought, it actually hasn't done that great. It's actually decreased in size because of the deer coming through. This next one is probably one that most people haven't heard about. It's young snowbell. It's known from one population out here in the Davis Mountains and a few places down in Mexico. The population in the Davis Mountains, and the reason why it's called young snowbell, it's named after Mary Sophie Young. She collected it in about 1914. And about 100 years later, it was found again. Her collection basically stated in the canyons of Olympia, which is basically Olympia Canyon, Olympia Creek, and nobody really knew where that was. And of course, you can imagine The ranch that we found it on is 108,000 acres. Back in the day, it was probably closer to 225,000 acres. So these are pretty large stretches of land. And this one in particular, up until about 2016, there were really no botanists ever on this property. But in 2014, Patty Manning found a small population of this on another piece of property adjacent to this. And she was not allowed to sort of publish anything about it because the landowner got a little antsy about that information being released. 4 years later, Jeff Keeling and one of the landowners, James Wynn, came across 2 plants. A slight bit later, I'd say within a month, they started seeing or finding more and more of them. And currently we're up to around 200 individuals on this one piece of property. But this is just one of those things, like when you find it, you see it, it's like, holy cow, there's a ton of this stuff growing on these outcrops. And we haven't even surveyed all the property yet. This is just like from 2 areas on the ranch that we've been to. It's really difficult to get there. We have been trying to collect seed on this because of drought. We have not been able to do that. So this year we're going to try root and stem cuttings, which we've had success with some other plants here recently. So hopefully, this is one that we'll have in cultivation at some point. And in cultivation may mean just at San Antonio Botanic Garden. I do have one of these in my back garden. It was grown by Dan Hosage, and the thought is that it came out of one of the populations in Mexico, but nobody really knows where it came from. So knowing where our plants come from at San Antonio is kind of a big deal. So I'm hoping we'll be able to grow this one this year. Here's another one that we were working with last year, yellow lady slipper orchid. I'm sure that you've probably seen photos of this, but this is found in Mesic hardwood forest out in East Texas. There's only a handful of populations known. If you look at all those little yellow dots in Texas and elsewhere, sadly, some of those are no longer around. Some of those populations may just be one plant. They're so widely dispersed that last year, 2 years ago, it was last year, Adam Black, he's someone I work with quite often. We were out hand pollinating these plants, and there are just so few plants that they basically needed some help. And so we had to, or Adam was actually doing this. He was collecting pollen from one population, keeping it in a small Ziploc bag, in a small cooler, and then driving 50 to 100 miles to the next population and inserting those pollinia, those pollen sacs into these other plants. They had something like 95 to 100% success on these, so they were able to collect seed. That seed was then collected, sent to Longwood Gardens with a guy named Peter Zale, and from there he grew those out on some agar plates. And now those plants are making their way back to Stephen F. Austin University, where once they're grown out, they're a little bit larger, they'll be reintroduced to the wild. So it's sort of, people applaud that. It's like, wow, that's amazing. That's such a great success story, which it is. It's really cool that we can do that. However, 20 years ago, when I was first introduced to this plant, we knew that it was rare then. And so quite often within plant conservation circles, we kind of wait till that very last moment until we absolutely have to do something. And it's like almost we're documenting the decline, almost that extinction of a species. And then the last moment we're going to step in and do something about it. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And I think that we should have been growing this plant 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when we knew that it was at risk. It has been at risk for a very long time, as is this plant, which I'm sure y'all know. Big red sage. It is a G1, S1, so that means it's very, very, very rare. There's some recent populations that were discovered, I'd say, within the past 10 to 15 years. I think one of those is sort of an accidental. Somebody may have been just canoeing or kayaking down a creek, Bernie Creek, somewhere over in that area, Cibolo Creek. and found a small population. There's another larger population right off I-10. Sadly, that there's a hospital going in right next to it. So we'll see what we can do to sort of save that. I'm sure y'all have seen this in the nursery trade. The plants that are in the nursery trade, there's some DNA work done a while back on them, that the genetic diversity in the plants in the nursery trade are really quite low, whereas the wild populations are really quite high. And so now the thought is to collect more of the wild population and get that into the hands of some of these growers. So that way there's a higher genetic diversity in the plants that are being sold to the public. It is one of those plants that probably the nursery trade is helping this one along because it is so popular. It's, if anyone's seen it, it's a pretty striking plant. And it's something that really, deserves to be in many, many gardens. So through San Antonio, some of the things that we're doing, we are doing some seed collection on this, constantly looking for new populations, and that sort of goes with just about every plant out there, every rare plant. Monitoring, I have stopped by the site there off I-10 to take a look at this a few times, and eventually we're going to have to just make contact with the construction crew to make sure that they don't do something like, oh, this looks like a really great place to empty out our concrete trucks and just sort of dump all the excess waste on top of these plants. Eventually some reintroduction in the areas, and of course propagation. We're just trying to continue to propagate these plants at San Antonio. The next one, this is one that's found up in Travis County. So Pace Bend Park, and there are some other areas sort of in northern Travis County on some private land. This was listed as rare, and oddly enough, it's up at Fort Hood, up in Killeen, and then there's some other weird populations over in Alabama, and I think that there's also some plants found somewhere in the Caribbean, if I remember correctly. Habitat loss, and this is mainly just through urbanization, people buying up tracts of land and putting in suburbia. Generally found in oak juniper woodlands throughout that area, but more so down in sort of the canyon areas. And while this one's listed as rare, it is, or it can be incredibly common where it grows. This would make a really nice landscape plant for one, but it's one of the properties that we've worked on probably has in the realm of the mid thousands, 4,000 to 7,000 plants. It's very, very prolific, but it's very isolated in this one area where it's found. I do know that some folks are working with doing some propagation on this, mainly stem cuttings, to try to get this sort of in the nursery trade. Beyond that, we're just doing sort of general monitoring of these plants. I will say the population up at Killeen on Fort Hood is highly, highly protected since it is on the military base. So that's one of the good things about that one. This is a ragweed, but it's a really nice ragweed, ambrosia. It is listed as endangered. It is a coastal prairie plant, so with less than something like 3% of coastal prairie remaining, it's habitat loss. It's competing with ag land and invasives and all sorts of other things. However, it does make a really nice landscape plant. We have some growing at San Antonio Botanic Garden, and it's rhizomatous, so it sort of makes this nice carpet. And when it does sort of flush out during the summertime, especially after the summer rains, it just looks amazing. So it's one of those plants that, while rare, it has a very specific application in landscapes. And this acts as sort of that low ground cover, has that silver blue foliage, which is really nice and sort of contrasts with some of the other things. We are monitoring various populations that are currently known. We're obviously looking for new populations. We have collected plant material that we have growing in our greenhouse. And eventually we'll do some reintroduction to some areas down in South Texas. Sadly, all the plants that we have in our garden that are planted out at San Antonio, we don't really know where those came from. We have a pretty good idea. They're probably from the Bishop area, that population down there, but we're not 100% sure. The next one we have, and we're running out of time. Asclepias prostrata. This is the prostrate milkweed. I'm sure y'all have seen or heard about this one, especially if you're a milkweed nut. It is currently a candidate for listing for endangered species status. By far, habitat loss, invasive species, bufflegrass outcompetes this guy pretty readily. It's found in open areas in the Tamaulipas and thorn scrub, only known from 2 counties in South Texas or 3 counties in South Texas and adjacent Mexico. It is being poached, I will say that. I know this because I go down there quite often to check on them, and you can tell that people have been collecting fruits. But we have been able to collect seed. I think over the 4 years I've been monitoring it, we've collected seed twice. We are looking at reintroducing the species. We have found new populations, which is good. We continue to monitor those old populations that we've known about, and we're generating propagation data there at San Antonio. Sort of germination protocols, that sort of thing. That became very important when Fish and Wildlife contacted us and we're looking at proposing this as an endangered species. They needed to know all this information. Strangely enough, this plant is linked to tarantulas. Anyone want to guess how? Type it in the chat.
I love tarantulas and I love this milkweed, but I have no idea how they're connected.
That's the pollinator, the tarantula hawk. And
I should have been able to guess that.
So, you know, when you talk about like people saying, oh, well, what's the big deal if one species goes missing? Well, there's 3 species right here linked together: the tarantula hawk, the tarantula, and the prostrate milkweed. Now, tarantula hawks, they pollinate all sorts of other plants as well, but this is one that you could easily say, like, this is, you know, there are 3 species, 2 of them a spider and a milkweed. You wouldn't think how they would be linked, but they are. And this is actually the first photo. This one does not show the pollinia on the legs of the tarantula hawk, but this is the first sort of documented photos of the tarantula hawk on a milkweed plant, the prostrate milkweed plant anyway. It was kind of a big deal whenever I was able to share this with the Fish and Wildlife folks. So I had to go through probably about 1,000 photos to find one that was clear enough showing the pollinia on the legs. Here's another plant that's really quite rare south of San Antonio. This is Cesalpinia phylanthoides. It's one of our bird of paradises. It's only known from really a couple populations along these sort of limestone outcrops outside of Lake Mathis. It took me about 7 years to finally photograph this plant in flower. It was constantly being either mowed down or just miss it. But quite often it was just the landowner just kept going out there and mowing and mowing and mowing. And eventually I found him, or he found me, I should say, and I asked him to stop. And so hopefully he did. And so this year I was able to get photos of this guy for the first time. And I need to go back and see if it's actually produced any seed, but there was only 1 flower at that point. Of course, we were in a drought. With this one, we definitely have to work with landowners to get new populations, because the only accessible population that we know about currently that's still around is a road cut just out on the west side of Lake Corpus Christi. Another coastal prairie plant, Echianthus chandleri, the lily of the plains. Again, you know, this might be old hat, but it's habitat loss, invasives, and what we're doing with that, again, seed collection, monitoring, reintroduction. One of our cactus species out here in West Texas that we've been monitoring, this is Echinoceros divicii. It is an endangered species. Sadly, the direct cause of this one to sort of be decreased in the wild, it was never really super common because it's only found on the maculite out here, but it's poaching. One of the populations we've been monitoring is basically gone at this point. It was a roadside population, and people have just slowly sort of picked through it. There might be a couple of plants left, but for the most part, it's pretty much done with. Sadly, now people are hopping the fence to get onto the private land adjacent to the road cut to see if they can find anything. More about that later. Another South Texas species, it's one of our 5 species of Manfreda that we have. This is found more on sort of saline soil down in deep South Texas. Again, habitat loss. It used to be somewhat easy to find this, I should say, but now as those areas around in Stark County are sort of expanding out. Back in the day, the landowners, while there were cattle, while there were deer, there were certain issues that were certain threats. Now the biggest threat is just people buying up these small tracts of land, and they will absolutely bulldoze everything on that land to sort of sculpt it, build their little house, their little McMansion, their ranchette, put in a pond, all these other things, and basically scrape the land clean of almost everything. A lot of people down there don't really appreciate that the sort of tamaleep and thorn scrub and what's all there. I mean, yes, it's prickly. Just about everything down there has a spine, but it's not really appreciated. So when they're building their new houses, they just scrape everything to the ground. We have been able to find some new populations on some private land down there. Seed collection has been few and far between. It's probably been about 7 years since I've been able to find some mature seed on this plant. We do have some of these plants at San Antonio. Again, we don't know where they came from. And we have shared that plant material, that unknown plant material, with various botanic gardens around Texas. One of my favorite plants down in South Texas, Manihot walkeri, Walker's Manihot. This one listed endangered, habitat loss, as everything else down there. This photo was actually taken adjacent to a cemetery. And we don't really know what the future of that land holds. The person that had given us access in the past has recently passed away. So we're, again, not sure what, we're kind of in limbo at this point. Luckily, we have collected cuttings of this plant. We are growing this population at San Antonio Botanic Garden. So all the plants that we have currently at San Antonio are from this population adjacent to the cemetery. We've also collected seed off this population. Those are in our seed bank. We monitor the other populations that are out there. I'm hoping at some point we can get together some folks and potentially purchase this little small, like 5-acre tract. But currently, one of the things we learned is the population it's very linear. So it stretches along this fence line, and there are 3 different landowners. So hopefully if just one of them sold us a portion of their property, this population would be protected. Another South Texas plant, which you've probably seen in the gardens if you walk through our rare plant area. It's the Thymophila tetraleuca, amazing landscape plant. This is one that Paul Cox collected, and it's been around and growing in the gardens for about 25 years now. It's really nice. It is listed as endangered. It's from South Texas grasslands, deep South Texas down there, sort of Laredo down to Rio Grande City. We've been doing monitoring. We do collect seed out of the population there in San Antonio in the gardens. We do share that with other folks, and we have been propagating it from time to time. The giant ball moss, Tillandsia baileyii, it's a G2S2 species, typically found in ebony forest. If you go further up the coast, you'll find it in some live oak forest, Quercus virginiana. Sadly, again, it's habitat loss, mainly due to housing developments. So this photo was taken on a vacant lot surrounded by really high-end houses down in just outside of Brownsville. The good thing is it's very easy to collect seed off these plants, and just about every time I go down there after a storm or just any sort of wind, or the tree branches get a little weak, these plants fall to the ground. So we just pick them up, take them back to the gardens, and I share them with other folks. One of our Metelias, this one, G1S1, Metelia radiata. It's one of the milkweed vines. Habitat loss, definitely. I'm not necessarily agreeing with the G1S1. I've got that little thing that says lazy botanist. More on that later, but We collected seed in 2017 from a piece of private land. The private land is about 300 acres. The landowner had cut all these different roads that go through his property. And once I showed him this plant, he took it upon himself to basically find every single one that he could locate. Found something like 25 plants. And now this is just that he could see from the road. And you have to imagine like the camellia thorn scrub is really, really, really thick. So you don't really want to be walking through it. But that was 25 plus or minus plants on one piece of property that was left. So, and I know for a fact that all of those plants were not considered whenever they were listing it as an S1G1. So it's probably more common. And it's definitely rare, but I don't think it's an S1G1. And working with the Wildflower Center back in 2017, we did reintroduce this species to that piece of property from seed collected off that property. Here's one that's sort of been a fun one to work with, the star cactus or Astrophyta mysterious. It is listed as endangered, deep South Texas. Known from, at this point, I think 3 or 4 populations. And then of course, in adjacent Mexico, the Mexican population is at high risk. I don't even know if that one's still existing at that point. Poaching has always been an issue. This has been a sort of a prized cactus for a very, very, very long time. You see this one for sale. I mean, just type it into eBay or online. You'll find people growing this all over the place. We did collect seed of this in 2017. It was the first time I was able to collect seed of this species from plants in the wild. Half that seed went to the Wildflower Center, the other half went to San Antonio. Sadly, the ones at San Antonio got misplaced, lost, overlooked during COVID and not watered. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but they all died. Luckily, I had some up in Austin, so I went and picked those up, brought those down to San Antonio. And then someone decided that they needed some sun, and they took them straight out of the greenhouse, put them outside in direct sun, and basically killed about 80% of them. So that was not a good thing. So we still have some of those left. But over time, we've been able to get some other seeds or some other plants from some other growers that have collected from wild populations in South Texas. So we've augmented our collection. I think we're up to about 50 specimens now. Recently, a landowner donated his whole collection of rare plants once he moved and sold his ranch. We are looking at some point reintroducing these on some private land in South Texas. So that's just sort of a spattering of our rare plants. You know, we often, talk about like, how do people help? And one of those is through donations and funding. Like that is our biggest hurdle. So we're always looking for funding for the rare plant and conservation department there at San Antonio. Funding, people always ask, like, where does it go to? I'll be honest, sometimes it pays for gas, sometimes it'll pay for an office chair, sometimes it'll pay for an expedition to go out and find something. You never know, but it all helps. Of course, volunteering at San Antonio. Now that I'm there full time, I can actually have volunteers that can help out in the greenhouse. Or at this point, it's just me, and we have sort of a part-time person or a full-time person that just has part of their time helping out in the greenhouse. And it's just really too much work for 1.5 people. Land access is always something. So if you know anyone that has property, you have property, getting access to land is a huge thing. So this is a piece of property that that Matelia I had shown you earlier. I'm going to see if I can pull up my little laser pointer, and you can kind of see this thing I'm outlining. That's his property. And you can see all this stuff is ag land. So this is an island of Tamaulipan thorn scrub in the middle of ag fields. And those are all the sort of the lines that he had cut through his property. He does wildlife management there. And it's an amazing piece of intact Tamaulipan thorn scrub, but it is an island, as you can see. There's really nothing around it. Field work. Occasionally we do need help with doing field work. This is a survey that we did for Astrophyta mysterious, and all those folks in that photo are volunteers. One person flew down from Ohio to help out because he just wanted to see this plant in the wild. At San Antonio, there's definitely some issues that we were dealing with when I first started working there. Part of that was just there was just no documentation of many of the plants we had. Actually, I think the vast majority of the plants we have at San Antonio or had at San Antonio did not have any sort of provenance. We just didn't know where they came from. So we needed to start doing seed collection with that associated data, which is what we started almost immediately. That first year we made our first collection. We began to replace the unknown plants with plants that had provenance. In the past 6 to 8 months, I was able to bring in 128 species of plants with provenance. 45 of those were rare or endangered species, and out of those 45, 27 were new species for the garden. Many of those are now planted in our expanded rare plant garden area that we have there at San Antonio. Through growing these things out, we can establish propagation protocols. We've established a collection policy and a database, which currently now is an Excel database, but we're deciding on which one we're going to buy at this point. We're able to share more information, plant, seed, and all sorts of other things with partners. That includes like Mercer, Lady Bird Johnson, Denver Botanic, or really anyone within the CPC partnership or any other botanic garden, both public and private. And we continue to monitor populations throughout Texas of the 13 CPC plants. But again, it does not stop at those 13 Center for Plant Conservation plants that we have for at San Antonio. And before I close out, who here participates in iNaturalist?
Me.
Oh, really? Who's that?
It's me, Lee.
Okay, well, we'll you might change your mind after this. Recently, I had seen a posting online of someone photographing some plants, and someone said, "Hey, what are you photographing?" And they said the plants they were photographing. And so I contacted this person and said, "Wow, who are you with?" And he didn't answer. And I said, "You can reply, private message if you want." So he replied, and basically he gave some song and dance about like he doesn't believe in the how did he put the European, how did he put it, something along the lines of the European patriarchy that has stolen the natives' land and blah 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 blah. So basically they were trespassing. And so I decided to look up this species on iNaturalist because I know where this population is. It's on private land. I've never been able to get access to it. And so every single one of these collections, all these people trespass. They did not have access to this property. And I started looking at some other folks or some other plants, and it's sort of the same thing over and over and over again. And so a lot of people tell me like, "Oh, we love iNaturalist because it's helping out with science. It does this, it does that." And I just had this conversation with somebody the other night, and I said, well, the thing is that, how many photographs do you need of Manihot walkeri from the population in South Texas to make sure that it's still there? And I think on some level, it's people that are just wanting to sort of up their numbers and say that they've seen this plant in the wild, and which I can appreciate because I love finding new stuff in the wild. But the person I was talking to the other night was also trespassing on the Botanist population of Manihot walkeri. And of course, he's like, "Oh no, it's a preserve. I was told it's a preserve." It's like, no, you had to walk around a giant 7-foot fence to get to it. It's private land, and you were trespassing. So I think it's also, while it's good to document a lot of stuff, it is leading to trespassing. And so somebody out there is sharing a lot of these very sensitive GPS coordinates. And that's what he told me. So he received the exact GPS coordinates for some of these plants. And so there are people out there sharing this information. Where they're getting it, I have no idea. But my question is, if you're willing to trespass to photograph, are you also willing to trespass to poach? maybe not you, but maybe the fifth person down the line that you've shared this information with is going to take one plant. Maybe they're going to take 5. Maybe they're going to take seed. All of those things are issues that we're having to deal with at this point. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I've developed a reputation out here in West Texas to where if a landowner is not going to give me access, I can appreciate that, but I'll continue asking. And hopefully through some of my other contacts, the landowners that I've worked with, that eventually I will get access. Quite often I've heard from landowners, the reason why they won't give me access is because they don't want this information to get out into the public, because then they'll get people trespassing to come out. And I never believed them. I was like, who in their right mind would do this? Well, apparently it is an issue, and it's becoming more and more common. And not just with iNaturalist folks. I've had some researchers come from out of state, which I've tried to help those folks in the past by getting land access, setting up days that we'd be out in the field together, only to hear a day or two later from them that say, oh, well, I found the plant. I don't need to go out to that property anymore. It's like, oh, where'd you find it? And they would tell me where they found it. It's like, so you were trespassing. And it's something that is not a good thing to be happening, especially when you have a large group of people that are working directly with landowners. We're doing research, we're developing these relationships, and it's not really helping the overall situation if you're just going out there trying to get a photograph for iNaturalist. I do know that you can obscure your data on iNaturalist. What I would ask you to do is don't put any GPS coordinates down or change your GPS coordinates altogether on some of these plants, because, or actually on all plants, that'd probably be best, because it is becoming more and more of an issue. And at that, I'll open it up to questions.
We do have a few questions, and let me just point out, somebody just contacted me. It looks like maybe permissions for the chat are set sort of weird for tonight. So I've been getting a lot of direct messages, and it might be because people aren't able to send their question to everybody. So just, I'm not sure if that's an issue or not, but it looks like it might be for some.
Okay.
Michael, there is a question, and I'm going to probably butcher this Latin name because I say it like I would spell it. So someone's asking if the perennial caltrop is the same as Calstremia parviflora.
No.
Okay.
It's Calstromia perennens.
Everybody knows that.
And it's the only perennial Calstromia here in Texas. So all the other ones are annuals, and that's hence the name perennial caltrop. It's known from I think 2, maybe 3 counties, actually 3, because the photograph I showed you was from Terrell County, which that was a new location. It's also found in Brewster and Presidio.
Okay, we got another question here.
Okay.
Is the greenhouse that you mentioned at the botanical garden, is that where the plant sales are held?
No. There are there's a lot of I don't know how many there are, like 5, 6, 8, something like that, greenhouses at San Antonio. Just one of those is where the plant sales are held. So the rare plants are held in a different greenhouse.
Okay, thank you. And then somebody else was asking where at the botanical gardens are the rare plants located? I'm guessing out in the beds.
Yeah, there. If you go to the pavilion there, where the various trails, that the one that goes to East Texas, and then the other one that goes to the Hill Country Trail, and there's a third trail that kind of wraps around and it goes to the cactus area. It's along that. I just found out this recently that cactus area was supposed to be the West Texas Trail, which was one of the last ones that they were going to put in, and I guess that never really materialized, and so you have a lot of non-native cactus along that slope. But it's in that area. So from that, if you know where the ocotillo and the large cacti and all that sort of stuff are, it's back there. So kind of the back part of the
Okay.
garden.
Thank you. And here's another question. Is there anything that NPSOT backyard gardeners can do to help?
Yes, there is, but it's more not necessarily about the rare plants. This is something I've been pushing for the NPSOT state to push, and I'm sure. Well, we're all part of NPSOT. NPSOT has a problem, and one of those problems is that it's often viewed as a garden club, and they don't do hard science. And when I was involved on the state board, I was very vocal. I'm sure I upset a lot of people. I said, we have to get out of this perception of being a garden club. And how do you do that? You need to start doing more science. You have to do some more conservation. They're looking at California Native Plant Society and sort of emulating them on some level. But we're kind of in these growing pains. We're sort of sitting at 3,000 members statewide. And, I've been to native plant sales with various native plants chapters throughout the state, and they're still selling non-native plants. They're still sharing, how to grow roses on Facebook pages. And, if you can't get past that, that's going to be an issue. And one of the things I've been trying to get the state board to do and to push for is a statewide program that can involve all chapters. And one of those things would very easily be local seed collection of your local genetics, those local ecotypes, and providing that to local growers. And that local grower can be somebody that's growing in their backyard. There's plenty of those around the state. So that's, I think, a big thing. Rare plants are a little tricky because you don't want folks just on their own thinking, oh, I'm helping, when they're actually not helping, because like the population of the Asclepias in South Texas, it's become sort of, I call it the Judas population now, because so many people know about it. And while it's a very easily accessible large population, and that you would think that that's where I could go collect seed, sadly, so many people are going down there now and collecting seed because they want to try to grow this and have it in their, in their garden. But as you all know, milkweeds are pretty tricky sometimes. And so something like that, we don't even try to propagate a lot of that at San Antonio. At this point, we're looking at sending that off to Longwood to have those folks grow those out for us and then send the plants back to us. So in backyard gardens, what I would suggest, high diversity plantings. The more diversity, the better. And then if you're going to do any seed collection, do it locally. And if you're looking at collecting rare stuff, wherever you are, just contact the people. Like if you're in San Antonio, I would be the person probably to contact about what we could collect if, let's say, you have private land. And eventually what I'm hoping is some of these plants that we're collecting will eventually make it into our plant sales there at San Antonio, and then folks can have the snowbells or whatever it may be that's appropriate for San Antonio to grow there. So it's a complicated issue because there's the conservationists that don't really necessarily want, just because you're growing it in your backyard doesn't mean you've saved that species, because it's really not like, it's not as if a researcher could come by and collect seed or plant material from that. Botanic gardens on that side are really, that's one of the good reasons to have botanic gardens, to have those rare plants in there. They're in the beginning, but then it's a process of, as we get more seed, you get that built up, then you can start providing that to the general public so they can have those things in their garden. Hopefully that answers your question. So
thank you. That's a lot of great information for sure. There's a few more questions here. Somebody's asking if any of the Texas Aristocola vines are rare.
I don't think any of the Aristolochias are rare. They're uncommon throughout their range. There's one plant, Aristolochia something or another, Peltandra maybe, that was collected once in Starr County. It's now a parking lot, but it's somewhat known in Florida, and then it's very, very common in Mexico. So I don't know of any other ones that are any of the other Aristolochias, like the Corii, the Rhytii, all those are pretty common out here. There's the Isotrema, which is over in East Texas. There's a handful of populations in Texas, but it's incredibly common once you get over outside of Texas, especially to the northeast.
Okay, sorry, I butchered that Latin name.
That's all right.
I'm glad you knew what I was talking about anyways. There's another question. This is a good one. How should somebody contact you if they would like to volunteer and help you in the greenhouse?
I should probably have that written down somewhere. It's just M. Eason. That's pretty easy, at sabot.org. And yeah, and also, I mean, I am a member of this chapter, so you can probably find me through that. Or michael.eason@NPSOT.org. I think my email is on the state page somewhere, maybe. But yeah, so volunteers are something that we're this is a discussion that we've been having at San Antonio. Like I just want dedicated rare plant volunteers. I don't want someone that's also working somewhere else and then like maybe 1 hour a week they're going to pop over and like do some weeding. That's not what we need. We need someone that is more dedicated to this, and so they can take the knowledge that I have, I can share that with them, and then we have seed collection that needs to happen throughout the garden. That's going to happen really, really soon. The styracs are going to start dropping here pretty soon, so we need someone that on a regular basis, let's say twice a week maybe, that can check on these plants. So if we had like 3 to 5 people helping out, that would be a huge thing.
All right, well, maybe some of our attendees tonight are going to be able to do that for you. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
We've got some good comments about loving your message that you're sharing and people want to help. And there's also a comment here about iNaturalist. And I'm saddened to hear the story you were telling about the species, the rare species and the trespassing. I'm not surprised. I still love iNat just because it is a great place to document species. And the question here is that there are some, for rare animals at least, the data is obscured for rare species, and the person's wondering if the same is done for plants. If not, why not? The location, why wouldn't the location be obscured if it was an identified rare species?
They are obscured, and so what that means is the public can't see them. So I can go on there and I can look at all those observations of that minima that I showed you. All of those were obscured, but I know where those populations are, and they're all in private land. So they end up obscuring them, and you get like a 10-kilometer radius or something like that. But people are funny creatures, and they're very cliquish, and they like to belong to certain groups. This probably goes on throughout our whole lives. It probably started back in grade school. And so, let's say you're one of those, I've ID'd 10,000 species and I have, 5,000 observations. All of a sudden you're in this next level of iNaturalist folks. And I know that this happens. And so they're very cliquish. And as you become up those ranks within iNaturalist, then it's very easy for someone to send a message out to another member of iNaturalist and say, hey, I'm traveling to South Texas and I'd love to see this, whatever it may be. Could you share your GPS coordinates? And they may look at your profile and say, oh, wow, yeah, this person's legit. They've got like, 20,000 identifications. They've got, 10,000 observations. They're going to be good. You don't necessarily know that person. And so my point is that while those are obscured, it doesn't stop people from sharing this information. And I think at this point, like the cat's out of the bag, or however you want to say it, like so many people are sharing this information, and it's like there's the subset groups on iNaturalist, and then of course there's the cactophiles and the asclepioids and all those other folks that are sharing this information now. So that's why I say that the Asclepias population, the prostrata in Starr County, is sort of the Judas population now, because it's just like, it is what it is. There's so many people that know about it. So many people are going down there and collecting fruits. I'm sure they're digging up plants as well. So it's a tough thing to deal with, but it's something that needs to be said. And I do not post anything to iNaturalist at all. It's something that I kind of saw that a very long time ago when a landowner that I worked with was telling me that he had some people that came out and they were documenting some of the plants and animals that are on their property. And I said, well, you know that that's all public knowledge. And he had no clue that all this was on the internet. And he was really upset. So I think in the beginning, at least, there were some landowners that were sort of being misled. And, this is another conversation I had. Like sometimes it may be you get invited out to somebody's property and, you're a guest of a guest, and you're like, oh, I'm going to take a walk around and I want to take some photographs, and not realizing maybe that landowner does not want all that information out there. And that happens occasionally too. So it's this fine line that like I can appreciate, like there's been some really cool finds on iNaturalist, but at what cost? So yes, the information is obscured, but it doesn't stop that information from being shared amongst people. So you have to be careful about that.
I definitely see your point. And yeah, it's too bad. I think it's a great way to document biodiversity, certainly on public lands. And it's an easy way to document through time biodiversity, simple way. There is also, you have to be really careful. You can't just take it as, even though it says it's research grade, you really can't automatically assume that it's a correct identification, which is another issue with it, but that's a whole separate issue we could spend hours on.
Right.
And it's 8:26, so we're done by now. We have one more question, I think, though. Well, okay, let's see. So do you have any nurseries that you recommend?
Those guys over in Medina, by far, they're really good. Medina Garden Nursery, Ernesto and Ismael. So if you've never been there, you need to go. They do buy locally from some of the larger growers, but they also grow a lot of their own stuff. If you ever come out here to West Texas, which I think some of y'all probably will during the symposium, Patty Manning and Sol Ross, they grow a lot of really cool West Texas species. I collect a lot from them. There was a recent article, if you ever need to buy a yucca, contact Hovind Riley at Big Bend Yucca. That just came out in Texas Monthly. He seed grows everything. He's not harvesting anything from the wild. So he's somebody up in Dallas. There's a handful of folks. I'm not going to remember their names right now. But there's a handful of folks around. But what I highly recommend is, this sort of gets back to working with the state board, is, San Antonio establishing somehow a propagation program to where you're collecting and propagating. And perhaps there might be something that San Antonio Botanic Garden could do in the future, working with this chapter. It's one of the things that I was really surprised to see, that there's not a whole lot of interaction between SABOT and the local San Antonio chapter. So hopefully that can change here in the near future. It seems like a sort of a win-win to have the local NPSOT chapter be involved with the local Botanic Garden. So But locally, yeah, those guys, if you go to South Texas, there's a guy named Mike Heap. He does a lot of South Texas plants. So again, he grows out of his backyard, but he's probably has, you know, a couple of hundred different species that he grows from South Texas.
Great. Okay, so somebody asked if I would repeat the information about the Fall Symposium, which is happening in Alpine, Texas in September. It's our Native Plant Society of Texas Fall Symposium. So it's going to be offered both virtually and if you want to go in person in Alpine, Texas, September 22nd through the 25th. And for more information and to register, you can go to the Native Plant Society of Texas state website, so npsot.org. And it is 8:29, so we should probably cut it short. A lot of comments have come in. Thanking you so much, Michael, for joining us. You showed us some really amazing, beautiful native plants that are rare, and a couple of surprises, at least for me, probably for a lot of other people too. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. That was great information.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And we'll maybe see you soon.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody. And also, the link was put in there for the SAWS Water Saver rewards. If you're going to use those, you need to go fill out the quiz by midnight tonight. So go up in the chat and find the link if you don't know where to go.
There might be a trick question in there, but the answer is humans.
Hopefully they stuck around for that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There might be two trick questions, but I did pass along the answers. So, all righty. Well, thanks again, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. Oh, and could you also put me on the mailing list? Even though I'm a member, I don't get anything from San Antonio chapter.
Well, we'll get that figured out. I know some people were having issues recently with their newsletters going into the junk box for some reason, but we think we've solved that problem, but we'll make sure that
I think part of it was I had signed up for my membership was due in, I think, October. And so when I renewed it as a dual membership, that was back in like March or April. And so they said it was going to wait till October for all that like to kick in. I don't know how all that works, but anyway.
I'm not sure either, but if you're a member, then you should be getting our stuff. So we'll check that out for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks again. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Lee. That went very well. It was a really good presentation.
Thanks, Fred.
Talk to you soon.
See you later.